The apartment in Rome was dimly lit, the kind of romantic setting that might conclude a holiday between two people falling in love. Mordechai Vanunu followed Cindy through the door, his mind occupied with thoughts of art galleries and Italian restaurants, perhaps a quiet evening before returning to London. He had known this American woman for only a few weeks, but she had brought lightness to his life during a dark time. She smiled at him as he stepped inside, and in that moment everything changed. Two men emerged from the shadows with practiced precision. They grabbed Vanunu before he could react, forcing him to the ground with professional efficiency. His arms were wrenched behind his back, and handcuffs snapped onto his wrists with metallic finality. More restraints locked around his ankles. He struggled and tried to shout, but a hand clamped over his mouth. Then came the needle, piercing his arm and flooding his system with sedative. His vision began to blur and his muscles went slack. The last thing he saw before consciousness faded was Cindy's face, no longer warm and friendly, but cold and professional. She wasn't an American tourist. She was Mossad, and Mordechai Vanunu, the man who had just exposed Israel's nuclear arsenal to the world, was about to disappear. The operation unfolding in that Rome apartment on September 30th, 1986, represented one of the most sophisticated and controversial intelligence operations in Mossad's history. It combined psychological manipulation, honey trap seduction, international surveillance, and naval logistics to kidnap a whistleblower from European soil and smuggle him back to Israel to face trial for treason. The woman who called herself Cindy was actually Cheryl Bentov, an American-born Mossad agent who had spent weeks carefully building trust with Vanunu and exploiting his loneliness to lure him into a trap. The intelligence operation that brought them to that moment began months earlier, when Israeli intelligence learned that one of their nuclear technicians had fled the country and was preparing to reveal Israel's most closely guarded secret, the extent of its nuclear weapons program. The stakes couldn't have been higher. Israel's entire nuclear doctrine rested on a policy of deliberate ambiguity, neither confirming nor denying possession of nuclear weapons. This strategic opacity provided diplomatic cover while maintaining deterrent capability. A single technician with photographs from inside the Dimona nuclear facility threatened to shatter that ambiguity permanently. Israeli intelligence would need to stop him before the revelations became public, but they faced a significant challenge. Vanunu had fled to London and was working with the Sunday Times newspaper. Abducting him from British soil risked destroying Israel's relationship with Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher's government. The solution required luring Vanunu to a third country where Mossad could operate with less diplomatic risk, and that solution would depend on exploiting the psychological profile of a lonely man searching for connection in a foreign city. Before we dive into how Mossad planned and executed this operation, I want to tell you what this channel delivers every single week. We bring you real intelligence operations with genuine tradecraft, psychological manipulation techniques, and moral complexity that reveals how intelligence agencies actually operate. If you're fascinated by honey trap operations, surveillance detection, and the human vulnerabilities that intelligence services exploit to achieve their objectives, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. What you're about to hear reveals the sophisticated psychological operations that made the Vanunu abduction possible, the intelligence failures that led to the operation being exposed, and why this single kidnapping created more international attention for Israel's nuclear program than the original newspaper revelations ever would have achieved alone. The operational details get even more intense from here. All right, back to how Mordechai Vanunu became the target of one of Mossad's most audacious operations. To understand why Israeli intelligence dedicated massive resources to capturing him, you need to understand his journey from loyal employee to whistleblower. In 1976, Vanunu applied for a job at the Negev Nuclear Research Center, known publicly as Dimona after the nearby desert city. He had heard from a friend of his brother Martyr that well-paying jobs were being advertised at the facility. After a lengthy interview with the facility's security officer and extensive background checks, he was accepted for training. The security protocols were extensive. Vanunu signed a contract forbidding disclosure of sensitive security materials and had to promise not to visit any Arab or communist countries for 5 years after his employment at the facility ended. He passed health checks and psychological evaluations designed to identify anyone who might pose a security risk. For the next 8 years, Vanunu worked as a nuclear technician at Dimona. The facility itself was Israel's most classified installation, built during the 1960s with French assistance and operating in complete secrecy. Israel maintained a public position that Dimona was a peaceful research reactor, but intelligence agencies worldwide understood the truth. The facility produced weapons-grade plutonium for Israel's nuclear arsenal, making Israel the sixth nuclear power, despite never signing the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. Vanunu's work gave him access to the underground production facilities, the control rooms, and the technical processes involved in plutonium separation and weapons development. During his years at Dimona, Vanunu became increasingly troubled by what he witnessed. He understood that Israel was not simply maintaining a minimal deterrent, but had developed a substantial nuclear arsenal. The scale and sophistication of the program conflicted with his growing political consciousness and his opposition to weapons of mass destruction. By 1985, his disillusionment had reached a breaking point. He had also become politically active, expressing views that concerned his supervisors. In late 1985, Vanunu made a decision that would define the rest of his life. Before leaving his job at Dimona, he brought a camera to work. Over several visits, he secretly photographed approximately 60 images of the underground nuclear complex, the control rooms, the production equipment, and the technical processes. He took detailed photographs showing the scale of operations, the sophisticated techniques being employed, and the evidence that confirmed Israel possessed a far larger nuclear arsenal than most experts believed. The photographs represented an intelligence catastrophe waiting to happen. They showed things that were never meant to be seen by outsiders: the layout of the underground facilities, the separation processes for weapons-grade material, the control systems, and the production capacity. Vanunu also took notes and made drawings showing cross-sections of the entire complex. He understood the enormity of what he was doing and the risks he faced. Israeli law treated disclosure of nuclear secrets as treason, a capital offense. But Vanunu believed the world needed to know the truth about Israel's nuclear program, and that nuclear weapons proliferation posed a greater danger than the personal consequences he might face. After leaving Dimona, Vanunu traveled through Asia with the undeveloped film hidden in his backpack. He wandered through Nepal, Burma, and Thailand, considering his options and wrestling with the decision before him. In Nepal, he contemplated converting to Buddhism and leaving his past behind entirely. But the photographs remained in his possession, and the knowledge they contained weighed on his conscience. By May 1986, he had reached Sydney, Australia. There, in the King's Cross neighborhood, he found work as a dishwasher and later as a taxi driver. He lived in a hostel and began attending St. John's Anglican Church, where he met Reverend John McKnight, who worked with homeless people and drug addicts. The church community provided Vanunu with something he had been seeking: a sense of purpose and belonging outside the context of Israeli society and nuclear weapons. Through intense conversations with McKnight and other church members, Vanunu explored questions of conscience, morality, and individual responsibility. In July 1986, he converted to Christianity and was baptized in the Anglican Church of Australia. The conversion alienated him from his family back in Israel, who viewed his rejection of Judaism as a betrayal, compounding whatever other actions he might take. But for Vanunu, the conversion represented a break with his past and a commitment to principles that transcended national loyalty. While attending the church, Vanunu met Oscar Guerrero, a Colombian who presented himself as a freelance journalist. When Guerrero learned that Vanunu had worked at Dimona and possessed photographs documenting Israel's nuclear program, he grew intensely excited. Guerrero made contact with the Sunday Times in London, one of Britain's most prestigious newspapers known for investigative journalism. The Sunday Times editor Andrew Neil assigned the lead to the newspaper's award-winning investigative team called Insight. The task fell to Peter Hunham, an experienced investigative journalist who flew to Sydney to meet Vanunu and assess whether the story was legitimate. Over 11 days, Hunham conducted intensive interviews with Vanunu, examining the photographs and testing his technical knowledge. Vanunu demonstrated detailed understanding of nuclear production processes that only someone who had actually worked inside such a facility would possess. The photographs were technically sophisticated and showed facilities that matched what intelligence analysts believed existed at Dimona. Hunham became convinced that Vanunu was authentic and that the story represented one of the most significant nuclear revelations in decades. On September 10th, 1986, Vanunu and Hunham flew together from Sydney to London so that the Sunday Times could subject the material to exhaustive verification. While Vanunu believed he was safely collaborating with journalists who would protect his identity, Israeli intelligence had already detected the threat he posed. On September 7th, 1986, 3 days before Vanunu flew to London, two men identifying themselves as officers from Shin Bet, Israel's internal security service, approached Vanunu's older brother Albert in his carpentry shop in Beersheba. They questioned him about his brother and told him that Mordechai was in Australia talking to a British newspaper about his work at the Nuclear Research Centre. They urged Albert to dissuade his brother from proceeding and then made him sign a non-disclosure agreement barring him from talking about the meeting. The Shin Bet officers knew remarkably specific details about Vanunu's location and activities, which meant Israeli intelligence had been tracking him for some time. The intelligence community in Israel immediately recognized the catastrophic potential of Vanunu's revelations. This wasn't a theoretical threat or rumored disclosure. Israeli intelligence had specific information that a former Dimona technician was preparing to publish photographs and technical details in a major Western newspaper. Prime Minister Shimon Peres was briefed on the situation and convened meetings with senior intelligence officials to discuss response options. The discussions considered several possibilities. Assassination was evaluated and rejected. Shabtai Shavit, who later served as Mossad director, would later confirm that killing Vanunu was considered in 1986, but rejected because Jews don't do that to other Jews. Diplomatic pressure on Britain to suppress the story was discussed but deemed unlikely to succeed given British press freedom protections. The option that emerged as most viable was abduction. Kidnapping Vanunu and bringing him back to Israel for trial would achieve multiple objectives. It would allow Israel to prosecute him under Israeli law, demonstrating to other potential whistleblowers the consequences of betraying nuclear secrets. It would give Israeli intelligence the opportunity to interrogate Vanunu and determine exactly what he had disclosed and to whom. And it would physically remove him from the journalistic process, potentially disrupting or delaying publication. Peres authorized Mossad to plan and execute a covert operation to capture Vanunu, but he imposed a critical constraint. The operation could not take place on British soil. Israel's relationship with Margaret Thatcher's government was too valuable to risk with an intelligence operation that violated British sovereignty. Mossad would need to lure Vanunu out of Britain to a country where the diplomatic consequences of discovery would be less severe. Mossad assigned the operation to Caesarea, its elite special operations unit responsible for high-risk missions requiring compartmentalization and specialized skills. The operation was headed by Giora Tzahor, an experienced Mossad officer who understood both the technical challenges of the mission and the political sensitivities involved. Surveillance teams were deployed to London to track Vanunu's movements and assess his security posture. Mossad operatives watched the Sunday Times offices, monitored Vanunu's hotel, and attempted to determine when the newspaper planned to publish the story. The surveillance revealed important intelligence about Vanunu's psychological state and vulnerabilities. Mossad psychologists analyzed the surveillance reports and developed a psychological profile of the target. Vanunu was living alone in London under an assumed name, isolated from family and the Israeli community. He had no romantic relationship and appeared lonely and emotionally vulnerable. His recent conversion to Christianity suggested someone searching for meaning and connection. The psychological assessment concluded that Vanunu was eager for female companionship and that this vulnerability could be exploited. Intelligence officers noted that several Mossad operatives had already attempted to befriend Vanunu in London using various pretexts, but Vanunu had detected and rejected these approaches. His suspicion of strangers suggested he possessed some operational awareness and wouldn't fall for obvious traps. The psychological profile informed the operational plan that emerged. Rather than using an Israeli operative who might trigger Vanunu's suspicions, Mossad would deploy an American agent whose background and mannerisms would seem completely divorced from Israeli intelligence. The operation would be built around seduction and romantic manipulation, a honey trap designed to exploit Vanunu's loneliness and desire for connection. The agent would need to be patient, allowing Vanunu to believe he was initiating the relationship rather than being targeted. And critically, the operation would need to lure Vanunu to a neutral country where Mossad teams could execute the abduction without interference from British security services. The agent selected for this mission was Cheryl Bentov, and her recruitment represented a convergence of background, timing, and operational requirements that made her nearly perfect for the role. Cheryl Hanen was born in 1960 and grew up in Pennsylvania and Orlando, Florida, in a Jewish family. Her father, Stanley Hanen, had founded Allied Discount Tires, a successful business that provided the family with a comfortable middle-class life. Cheryl attended Edgewater High School in Orlando, where classmates and administrators would later remember her as somewhat pudgy, a late bloomer who transformed into an attractive young woman. During high school, she spent a term in Israel at the Alexander Muss Institute for Israel Education in Hod HaSharon, an experience that deepened her connection to Israel and Jewish identity. Upon graduating from Edgewater High School in 1978, Cheryl made a decision that would alter the trajectory of her life. She moved to Israel and joined the Israeli army, a choice that was unusual for American Jews, but reflected her ideological commitment to the Jewish state. During her military service, she demonstrated qualities that attracted the attention of intelligence recruiters: language skills, cultural fluency in both American and Israeli contexts, discipline, and psychological resilience. In 1985, she married Ofer Bentov, himself an Israeli military intelligence officer, which placed her firmly within the intelligence community's social and professional networks. At some point before 1986, Mossad recruited and trained Cheryl for covert operations. The timing of her recruitment and training suggests that Mossad may have identified her as a potential asset for operations requiring an authentic American operative months or even years before the Vanunu case emerged. Intelligence services cultivate agents with diverse backgrounds precisely because they never know when specific skill sets will be needed for operational requirements. When the Vanunu operation demanded an American-born female agent who could credibly pose as a tourist and romantic interest, Cheryl Bentov's profile matched the requirements perfectly. She possessed genuine American background and mannerisms, spoke English as a native speaker, and could present herself as someone entirely disconnected from Israeli intelligence or government. The operational plan developed around Cheryl's deployment was sophisticated and psychologically informed. Mossad surveillance had revealed that Vanunu rejected obvious approaches from strangers, which meant Cheryl couldn't simply introduce herself and attempt to befriend him. The initial contact needed to appear completely accidental and natural. Intelligence officers studied Vanunu's routines and identified locations where casual encounters might occur. The strategy required patience and multiple encounters that would build slowly towards trust and connection. Cheryl would pose as Cindy, an American tourist exploring London, with a cover story that positioned her as someone Vanunu would find approachable and interesting. The first contact occurred in September 1986, when Cheryl engineered a seemingly chance encounter with Vanunu on a London street. Rather than approaching him directly, she positioned herself to cross paths with him and allowed him to initiate conversation. This detail proved critical to the operation's success. Vanunu would later recall that he initiated the relationship, which meant he never suspected that the encounter was staged. The psychology was subtle but profound. People trust interactions they believe they initiated more than interactions where they were approached. By creating conditions where Vanunu thought he was making the first move, Cheryl bypassed his defenses and suspicions. Over the following weeks, Cheryl carefully cultivated the relationship. They met for casual dates, attending movies, and visiting art galleries around London. She presented herself as interested in culture and conversation, someone who enjoyed exploring the city and meeting interesting people. The connection appeared to develop naturally, without pressure or obvious manipulation. Vanunu later insisted that he didn't fall in love with Cheryl, but he admitted he was attracted to her and enjoyed her company. For someone isolated in a foreign city and carrying the burden of secrets about to be revealed, the attention and companionship must have been welcome. But Vanunu wasn't completely naive. The thought had crossed his mind that Cindy might be working for Israeli intelligence. He understood that Mossad would be searching for him, and that they might use sophisticated methods to reach him. Intelligence training teaches operatives to trust their instincts, and Vanunu's instincts apparently registered warning signals about this convenient American tourist who had entered his life just as he prepared to expose Israel's nuclear program. Yet, he dismissed the suspicion. Perhaps he wanted to believe that not everything in his life was connected to the secret he carried. Perhaps he thought himself clever enough to detect a honey trap. Or perhaps the loneliness and attraction overwhelmed his caution. Whatever the reason, Vanunu continued the relationship and allowed trust to develop. While Cheryl built rapport with Vanunu in London, other elements of the operation moved into position. The Israeli Navy ship INS Noga, a signals intelligence vessel disguised as a merchant ship, was ordered to change course while returning from Turkey to Israel. The Noga was fitted with electronic surveillance equipment and satellite communications gear in its superstructure, and was primarily used to intercept communications traffic in Arab ports. The captain received an encrypted message instructing him to proceed to Italy and anchor off the coast of La Spezia, a port city on the Italian Riviera. The crew was given no explanation for the course change, but the captain understood that the ship would be supporting a covert operation. The Noga's ability to pose as a civilian merchant vessel while actually being a military intelligence platform made it ideal for smuggling Vanunu out of Italy once Mossad agents captured him. As September progressed, the Sunday Times verification process continued. Nuclear weapons experts examined Vanunu's photographs and found them authentic and deeply concerning. The images showed a sophisticated nuclear weapons production facility with capacity far exceeding what most analysts had estimated. Dr. Frank Barnaby, a nuclear physicist who examined the material, concluded that Israel possessed between 100 and 200 nuclear warheads, making it a nuclear power comparable to Britain, France, and China. The Sunday Times prepared to publish what would be one of the most significant nuclear weapons revelations in decades. Israeli intelligence understood that time was running out. Once the story appeared in print, Vanunu's value as a target would diminish. The priority was capturing him before publication. Cheryl executed the final phase of the operation with practiced skill. She told Vanunu that she had a sister living in Rome and suggested they take a holiday together to Italy. The proposal seemed spontaneous and romantic, an opportunity to deepen their connection while exploring a beautiful city. Rome offered several operational advantages from Mossad's perspective. Italy had weaker security oversight than Britain and historical relationships with Israel that might lead Italian authorities to quietly shelve any investigation. The city's tourist infrastructure meant that foreign visitors attracted little attention. And critically, Rome was accessible to the INS Noga waiting off Italy's coast. Vanunu agreed to the trip. On September 30th, 1986, he and Cheryl flew from London to Rome on British Airways Flight 504, with tickets purchased under the name Cindy Hannon. That ticket purchase would later prove to be Mossad's critical operational mistake, but in the moment it seemed like a minor administrative detail. The flight to Rome was routine, and Vanunu appeared relaxed and unsuspecting. He believed he was traveling with a woman he had been dating, taking a brief holiday before returning to London to complete his work with the Sunday Times. He had no idea that Mossad operatives were already in Rome preparing the apartment where he would be captured. He didn't know that the INS Noga was anchored off the Italian coast waiting to smuggle him to Israel. And he had no reason to suspect that Cindy, the American tourist who had brought unexpected warmth to his lonely existence in London, was actually Cheryl Bentov, a Mossad agent whose entire relationship with him had been constructed for this single purpose. The apartment in Rome was carefully selected for the operation. It provided privacy, controlled access, and proximity to transportation routes that would allow quick extraction once Vanunu was subdued. Mossad operatives had rented it under cover identities and prepared it for the abduction. 2 agents were positioned inside, waiting for Cheryl to bring Vanunu to the location. The operational plan called for overwhelming force applied immediately upon entry to prevent Vanunu from resisting or calling for help. The team had sedatives ready to render him unconscious for transport. Everything was prepared for the final phase of the operation. On the evening of September 30th, 1986, Cheryl brought Vanunu to the apartment. He followed her through the door, perhaps expecting a romantic evening, perhaps simply trusting that his companion would lead him somewhere safe and pleasant. The 2 men emerged from their concealment with professional speed. They grabbed Vanunu before he could process what was happening and forced him to the ground with techniques designed to control a subject without causing serious injury. Handcuffs locked onto his wrists and ankles, immobilizing him completely. Vanunu struggled and tried to shout, but a hand covered his mouth and muffled his cries. Then came the injection, a paralyzing drug that flooded his system and caused his muscles to go slack. As consciousness faded, Vanunu understood with terrible clarity what had happened. Cindy wasn't an American tourist. She wasn't someone who had accidentally crossed his path on a London street and developed genuine feelings for him. She was Israeli intelligence, and every moment of their relationship had been calculated manipulation designed to bring him to this moment. The weeks of conversation, the dates, the apparent connection, the suggestion of a Roman holiday, all of it had been tradecraft. He had been lured into a honey trap, and his loneliness and desire for human connection had been weaponized against him. The betrayal was both professional and deeply personal. She hadn't just captured an intelligence target. She had exploited his emotional vulnerability and used the basic human need for companionship as bait in a trap. I need to pause here and ask you something. If you were in Vanunu's position, trusting someone who seemed to offer genuine connection during an isolated and frightening time, and then discovered that every moment of that relationship had been manufactured manipulation, how would you process that betrayal? And if you were Cheryl Bentov, trained to use seduction and emotional manipulation as intelligence tools, how would you separate the professional requirements of your mission from the human cost of exploiting someone's loneliness? Drop your answer in the comments, because the psychological dimensions of honey trap operations raise questions about where legitimate intelligence work ends and human cruelty begins. Here's what happened after Vanunu lost consciousness. The Mossad agents worked quickly to prepare him for transport. They loaded his unconscious body into a van that had been positioned near the apartment. The van drove through Rome's streets toward the coast, where the INS Noga waited in international waters. Italian authorities later discovered traces of chloroform and sedatives in the apartment, but under diplomatic pressure from Israel, they quietly shelved the investigation rather than pursuing it as an international kidnapping. The crate, used to transport Vanunu from Italian territory to the ship, was labeled as audio-visual equipment and reportedly bore official seals from the Israeli embassy, giving it diplomatic immunity from customs inspection. Transfer to the INS Noga required careful coordination. The ship couldn't enter Italian territorial waters without risking detection and interdiction, which meant Vanunu needed to be transported to the vessel while it remained offshore. The Mossad team used a small boat to ferry Vanunu from the Italian coast to the intelligence ship. As they approached the Noga, the captain ordered the entire crew to assemble in the ship's common hall, behind locked doors. The sailors were told nothing about what was happening, and none were permitted to see the operation. Vanunu was brought aboard unconscious and taken to a secluded cabin that had been prepared for his detention. The Mossad agents would guard him in rotating shifts during the voyage to Israel, interrogating him periodically as he regained consciousness and keeping him isolated from the crew. On October 5, 1986, while the INS Noga sailed across the Mediterranean carrying its unconscious prisoner, the Sunday Times published the story that Vanunu had risked everything to tell. The front page carried a photograph of the Dimona reactor dome, and the headline revealed, "Secrets of Israel's Nuclear Arsenal." The article spread across 3 pages and included technical details and photographs that confirmed what intelligence analysts had long suspected but never proven. The revelations estimated that Israel had produced more than 100 nuclear warheads, possessed sophisticated plutonium separation technology, and had developed a nuclear arsenal that made it the 6th nuclear power in the world after the United States, Soviet Union, Britain, France, and China. The publication caused exactly the international sensation that Israeli intelligence had feared. Nuclear weapons experts worldwide examined the material and confirmed its authenticity. The photographs showed production facilities that could only exist within a substantial weapons program. The technical details demonstrated insider knowledge that could only come from someone who had actually worked at Dimona. The story undermined Israel's decades-long policy of nuclear ambiguity and provided confirmation that shifted the entire international discussion about nuclear proliferation in the Middle East. Arab states used the revelations to justify their own weapons programs and to argue that Israel posed an existential threat to regional stability. On October 7, 1986, the INS Noga anchored off the Israeli coast between Tel Aviv and Haifa. A smaller vessel approached the intelligence ship, and Vanunu was transferred from the Noga to this boat. He was landed on an Israeli beach, tied to a stretcher to prevent any possibility of escape, and immediately transported to an interrogation center. Shin Bet officers thrust a copy of the Sunday Times into his hands, showing him the published story spread across 3 pages. The gesture was both cruel and psychologically calculated. Vanunu could see that his mission to expose Israel's nuclear program had succeeded. The information was public and could never be suppressed, but he could also see that his actions would now be prosecuted under Israeli law, and the consequences would be severe. Vanunu was detained in Gedera prison in a wing run by Shin Bet. He was held in isolation and subjected to intensive interrogation. Intelligence officers wanted to determine exactly what he had disclosed to the Sunday Times, whether he had shared information with any other parties, and whether additional photographs or documents existed that might be published. The interrogations were professional but relentless, designed to extract every possible detail about Vanunu's contacts and activities since leaving Dimona. For weeks, Israeli authorities said nothing publicly about Vanunu's whereabouts. The Sunday Times story had mentioned that their source was a former Dimona technician, but Vanunu's identity and location remained uncertain. International media speculated that Israeli intelligence might have abducted the whistleblower, but without confirmation, the story remained conjecture. Finally, on November 9, 1986, after weeks of press reports speculating about Vanunu's fate, the Israeli government confirmed it was holding him prisoner. In a press conference, a government official stated that Mordechai Vanunu was detained in Israel by law under a court order. The Israeli government denied rumors that Vanunu had been kidnapped on British soil, calling such suggestions without foundation. The denial was technically accurate. Vanunu had been abducted in Italy, not Britain, but it deliberately obscured the reality that Mossad had kidnapped him from a foreign country and smuggled him to Israel in violation of international law. The confirmation that Israel held Vanunu triggered immediate responses from Italy and Britain. Italian Prime Minister Bettino Craxi announced that Italy was launching an investigation into whether Israeli agents had violated Italian sovereignty by conducting an intelligence operation on Italian soil. Craxi complained publicly that Israel was providing no cooperation with the investigation. British authorities faced criticism for allowing Mossad operatives to operate freely in London while developing the operation that led to Vanunu's abduction. Civil liberties organizations and press freedom advocates condemned the kidnapping as a blatant violation of international law and an assault on whistleblower protections. But Vanunu had one more card to play, and he played it brilliantly, despite his imprisonment. He was being transported to court proceedings in a prison van, and photographers were positioned outside to capture images of the infamous whistleblower. Vanunu knew he had no direct access to media and no ability to tell his story publicly. Israeli authorities had sealed him off from journalists and the outside world, but he found a way to communicate. He asked a security officer for a pen, and the officer, perhaps not understanding what Vanunu intended, provided one. Vanunu used the pen to write a message on his palm. As the van drove past the photographers, he pressed his hand against the window so the cameras could capture what he had written. The message read, "Vanunu M was hijacked in Rome ITL, the 30th of September, 86. 21 o'clock came to Rome by BA Fly 504. In that single pressed palm, Vanunu provided journalists with critical intelligence about his abduction. He confirmed he had been kidnapped in Rome, not London or anywhere else. He provided the date and approximate time of the operation. And critically, he identified the British Airways flight number that had brought him to Italy. That flight number would become the thread that allowed Peter Hunum and the Sunday Times to unravel the identity of the Mossad agent who had lured Vanunu into the trap. Hunum began investigating immediately. He obtained passenger manifests for British Airways Flight 504 on September 30th, 1986, and found that Vanunu had flown to Rome with a woman using the name Cindy Hannon. The name Hannon provided the crucial lead. Hunum traced the name to Orlando, Florida, where he found a Cindy Hannon who was about to be married. She was clearly not the Mossad agent. Her background and timeline didn't match, but Hunum had a hunch about family connections. His investigation revealed that Cindy Hannon's future sister-in-law was named Cheryl Hannon, and that Cheryl had left Orlando as a teenager, moved to Israel, joined the Israeli army, and was now married to Ofer Bentov, an Israeli military intelligence officer. The trail led to Netanya, a coastal city north of Tel Aviv, where Cheryl and Ofer Bentov were living in a rundown bungalow on a street beside the main Haifa highway. The location was convenient to the new Mossad headquarters on West Glilot Junction, just a few miles south, which reinforced the conclusion that Cheryl was actively employed by Israeli intelligence. In 1988, Hunum traveled to Israel and knocked on Cheryl Bentov's door. He announced that he was from the Sunday Times and asked if he could have a word with her. Cheryl's eyes registered shocked recognition. She invited him inside, perhaps calculating that refusing would appear more suspicious than engaging. Hunum outlined how the Sunday Times had painstakingly established that she was the spy who had engineered Vanunu's kidnapping. He explained the passenger manifest investigation, the family connection to Cindy Hannon in Florida, and the evidence linking her to Mossad. Cheryl became visibly agitated during the conversation. She complained that Hunum was tape recording her without permission. When he pointed out that she had not denied his allegations, she suddenly jumped up and ran across the room shouting, "I deny it! I deny everything!" The denial was theatrical and unconvincing, and her reaction to confrontation suggested someone unaccustomed to being exposed rather than someone confident in her cover. Hunum published his findings, and Cheryl Bentov became internationally famous as the Mossad agent who had seduced and betrayed Mordechai Vanunu. The exposure destroyed her career as a covert operative. An agent whose face and background are known publicly can never operate undercover again. Cheryl disappeared from the bungalow in Netanya shortly after Hunum's article appeared. She eventually returned to the United States, settling back in Florida with her husband, Ofer. Years later, Yediot Aronot, Israel's largest newspaper, quoted a close friend of Cheryl's in Florida, saying that she had left Israel to flee the media and the people who burrowed into her life. The friend reported that Cheryl was terrified about journalists who came into her home and asked questions, and that she felt a desperate need to run away from the exposure. The friend's statement captured the irony of Cheryl's situation. She had successfully executed a sophisticated intelligence operation, luring Vanunu across international borders into a trap that allowed Mossad to kidnap him and bring him to justice under Israeli law. But the operation's exposure had made her a public figure associated with honey trap operations and psychological manipulation. She wanted only one thing: a normal, quiet life, away from the intelligence work that had defined her 20s and early 30s. Photographs eventually surfaced showing Cheryl and Ofer on a walking holiday in Slovakia, attempting to build a life disconnected from their intelligence backgrounds. For Vanunu, the consequences of his decision to expose Israel's nuclear program were far more severe than professional exposure. He faced trial in Jerusalem District Court before Chief Justice Eliyahu Noam and Judges Zivi Tal and Shalom Brenner. The proceedings were conducted in secret, with no public or media access. Vanunu was initially represented by Amnon Zikroni and later by Avigdor Feldman, a prominent Israeli civil and human rights lawyer. The prosecutor was Uzi Hassan, who faced the question of whether to seek the death penalty. Treason is a capital offense under Israeli law, and Vanunu's actions clearly met the legal definition of treason. He had disclosed classified information about Israel's most sensitive defense program to foreign media in violation of his non-disclosure agreement and Israeli law. Former Mossad director Shabtai Shavat later revealed that Israeli intelligence had seriously considered extrajudicial execution when first learning about Vanunu's planned revelations. The option was debated among intelligence officials and political leaders, but it was ultimately rejected based on a principle that Shavat articulated clearly: Jews don't do that to other Jews. The statement reflected both operational calculation and cultural identity. Killing Vanunu would have been operationally simpler than kidnapping him from Europe, but it would have crossed a moral line that Israeli intelligence leadership was unwilling to cross when the target was a fellow Jew. Similarly, prosecutor Hassan announced that he would not seek the death penalty at trial, despite having legal grounds to do so. In March 1988, after a secret trial that examined evidence and arguments the public would never hear, Vanunu was convicted of treason and aggravated espionage. He was sentenced to 18 years in prison, a term that reflected both the seriousness of his offense under Israeli law and the government's determination to deter any future whistleblowers from following his example. But the sentence represented only the beginning of Vanunu's ordeal. Israeli prison authorities determined that he would serve most of his sentence in solitary confinement, isolated from other prisoners and subjected to conditions that human rights organizations would later characterize as cruel, inhuman, and degrading. The cell where Vanunu spent the first 2.5 years measured 2 by 3 meters, barely large enough to lie down. For those initial years, the cell had no natural light. A fluorescent tube remained illuminated 24 hours a day, disrupting normal sleep cycles and creating constant, artificial brightness that human psychology finds profoundly disturbing. Vanunu was permitted minimal contact with the outside world. He could write and receive letters, though all correspondence passed through censors who cut out any passages deemed objectionable. He could read newspapers, also censored. His visitors were restricted to a handful of family members, most of whom had rejected him because of his conversion to Christianity, and his lawyers. Amnesty International examined Vanunu's treatment and concluded that his conditions of confinement violated international standards. The organization called his imprisonment cruel, inhuman, and degrading, particularly given that Israeli penal code contained no provision for the kind of extended, solitary confinement to which he was subjected. The isolation wasn't mandated by his conviction or sentence, but appeared to be an administrative decision designed either to prevent him from communicating with other prisoners or to punish him for his actions. Vanunu later reported that he was treated like a Palestinian prisoner rather than a Jewish one, denied privileges that other Israeli prisoners received routinely. The psychological impact of prolonged solitary confinement is well documented. Human beings are social creatures who require interaction, stimulation, and connection to maintain mental health. Extended isolation produces depression, anxiety, cognitive impairment, hallucinations, and difficulty distinguishing reality from delusion. Vanunu's mind began deteriorating under the strain of isolation. Letters he wrote during this period, later released with censored sections cut out, showed someone struggling to maintain coherence and purpose. He numbered every letter, and by the time of his release he had written more than 2,400 letters from prison, each one a lifeline to the outside world and evidence of his determination not to be forgotten. Yet even as Vanunu suffered in isolation, he continued refusing compromises that might have secured his early release. Israeli authorities offered him a deal approximately a year before his scheduled release. They would grant him early parole if he signed a pledge never to discuss Dimona, his abduction by Mossad, or details of his trial and imprisonment. For the first time in 17 years, Vanunu was a penstroke away from freedom. He could walk out of prison, resume some semblance of normal life, and put the nightmare of solitary confinement behind him. But accepting the deal required agreeing to permanent silence about the very issues that had motivated his original decision to become a whistleblower. Vanunu refused to sign. He would not compromise his freedom of speech even to escape the cell where he had spent most of his adult life. On April 21, 2004, after serving his full 18-year sentence, Vanunu was released from Ashkelon prison. He walked out into sunshine and fresh air after 11 years in solitary confinement and 7 additional years under less restrictive but still isolated conditions. His brother Martyr was there to meet him, and supporters from around the world had campaigned for his release. But Vanunu was not free in any meaningful sense. Israeli authorities immediately imposed a broad array of restrictions that severely limited his ability to speak, travel, or live normally. He was forbidden from leaving Israel, prohibited from approaching foreign embassies or borders, restricted from communicating with foreigners, and required to notify authorities whenever he traveled between Israeli cities. The restrictions were justified on national security grounds. Israeli officials claimed that despite having served his sentence, Vanunu still possessed classified information about Israel's nuclear program that could harm national security if disclosed. Critics argued that after 18 years, any technical information Vanunu possessed would be hopelessly outdated, and that the restrictions were actually designed to prevent him from publicly discussing his kidnapping and treatment, which would embarrass Israel internationally. Vanunu himself expressed a desire to leave Israel permanently and move to Scandinavia, Ireland, or France, but authorities denied all requests for permission to emigrate. The restrictions led to multiple arrests when Vanunu violated their terms. He gave interviews to foreign journalists despite being forbidden from doing so, arguing that his freedom of speech was a fundamental human right that the Israeli government could not legitimately suppress. He attempted to attend events at foreign embassies and churches in Jerusalem that served international communities. Each violation resulted in arrest, detention, and additional legal proceedings. In November 2004, just months after his release, he was arrested for giving an interview to a foreign journalist. In March 2005, he was charged with 21 counts of contravening a lawful direction, with maximum penalties of 2 years imprisonment per count, plus 1 count of attempting to contravene a lawful direction. International human rights organizations, press freedom advocates, and nuclear disarmament activists rallied to Vanunu's cause. He was nominated multiple times for the Nobel Peace Prize in recognition of his sacrifice to expose nuclear weapons proliferation. But he could not travel to Oslo to accept the honor if awarded because Israeli authorities refused to lift travel restrictions. Supporters organized campaigns demanding his freedom and arguing that his continued imprisonment and restriction violated international law and human rights principles. The Israeli government remained unmoved, maintaining that Vanunu posed an ongoing security threat that justified the restrictions. The international reaction to Vanunu's abduction and imprisonment revealed deep divisions in how different parties evaluated the legitimacy of his actions and Israel's response. Nuclear disarmament activists hailed Vanunu as a hero who had sacrificed his freedom to expose weapons of mass destruction and promote global security through transparency. They argued that Israel's nuclear program, developed in secret and never subjected to international oversight, represented exactly the kind of proliferation threat that the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty was designed to prevent. Vanunu's revelations from this perspective served the cause of peace by creating pressure for Israel to acknowledge its arsenal and submit to international inspection and control. Israeli officials and many supporters of Israel took the opposite view. They characterized Vanunu as a traitor who had violated his legal obligations, betrayed his country's trust, and disclosed classified information that put Israeli security at risk. They argued that Israel's nuclear program existed for defensive purposes in a region where multiple states had expressed determination to destroy Israel. The policy of nuclear ambiguity provided deterrent effect without triggering regional arms races, and Vanunu's revelations undermined that carefully calibrated strategy. From this perspective, his imprisonment was entirely justified under Israeli law and international norms that allow states to prosecute those who disclose classified national security information. Western governments, including Britain and the United States, found themselves in uncomfortable positions. They maintained close relationships with Israel and generally supported its right to self-defense and security. But they also faced questions about why Israeli intelligence had been permitted to operate kidnapping operations from British soil, and whether the abduction from Italy violated principles of sovereignty and international law that these nations claimed to uphold. The diplomatic responses were muted and carefully calibrated to avoid seriously damaging relationships with Israel while acknowledging some concerns about the methods used. The operational lessons from the Vanunu affair shaped intelligence practices for both Mossad and other services worldwide. The honey trap operation demonstrated the effectiveness of psychological manipulation and exploitation of human vulnerabilities in intelligence work. Cheryl Bentov's successful seduction of Vanunu validated the use of female agents in romantic entrapment operations and led to continued development of these techniques. Intelligence services studying the operation noted how Mossad psychologists had accurately assessed Vanunu's vulnerabilities and designed an approach that exploited his specific psychological state. But the operation also revealed significant weaknesses in operational security. The ticket purchase under Cheryl's sister-in-law's name represented a tradecraft failure that allowed journalists to identify the agent responsible for the honey trap. A more sophisticated operation would have used completely fictitious identities without any connection to real people who could be traced. Mossad had taken shortcuts in creating Cheryl's cover, perhaps confident that even if Vanunu reported being lured by someone named Cindy, investigators would never connect that name to a Mossad agent. That confidence proved misplaced when Peter Hunem demonstrated the kind of determined investigative journalism that can unravel even carefully constructed cover identities. The exposure of Cheryl Bentov had cascading effects for Mossad operations. Every active agent understood that operational mistakes could lead to public identification and the end of their covert careers. The case became a training example of how operational security failures compromise not just individual missions, but entire operational capabilities. Cheryl could never work undercover again, which meant Mossad had permanently lost an agent who had successfully executed a high-profile operation. The loss wasn't just professional, but personal. Cheryl had dedicated years to Israeli intelligence, completed a mission that achieved its tactical objectives, and ended up publicly exposed and forced to flee to Florida to escape media attention. The strategic assessment of whether the Vanunu operation succeeded or failed produced contradictory conclusions depending on evaluation criteria. Tactically, the operation was nearly flawless. Mossad identified a target, developed psychological profiles, deployed an agent who successfully established trust, lured the target to neutral territory, executed the abduction, smuggled him to Israel, and delivered him for prosecution. Vanunu was convicted and imprisoned, spending 18 years removed from public discourse and unable to disclose additional classified information. The operation demonstrated Mossad's global reach and willingness to conduct high-risk operations to protect Israeli security interests. But strategically, the operation produced outcomes that contradicted Israeli intelligence objectives. The abduction itself generated far more international attention to Israel's nuclear program than the Sunday Times article alone would have achieved. Without the dramatic kidnapping story, the revelations might have been a significant news story that faded from headlines within weeks. The kidnapping turned Vanunu into an international cause célèbre and kept Israel's nuclear program in the news for years. Human rights organizations, nuclear disarmament activists, and press freedom advocates rallied around Vanunu precisely because his treatment seemed so disproportionate and unjust. The harsh conditions of Vanunu's imprisonment, particularly the 11 years in solitary confinement, further damaged Israel's international reputation. Amnesty International and other human rights organizations characterized his treatment as cruel and inhuman, putting Israel in the company of authoritarian regimes that systematically abuse prisoners. The restrictions imposed after his release created ongoing controversy and repeated arrests that kept the story alive in international media. Every time Vanunu violated restrictions by giving an interview or attempting to travel, news coverage reminded global audiences about Israel's nuclear program and the whistleblower who had exposed it. Peter Hunem, reflecting on the case years later, observed that working for Mossad is not a pathway to riches, and that Israeli intelligence makes many mistakes that would be unacceptable in more accountable systems. He noted that Israel's gung-ho tactics are frequently counterproductive, and that the kidnapping mostly attracted attention to the revelations rather than suppressing them. Hunem concluded that it was the inhumanity of Vanunu's treatment since his release that led many to view Israel as a country that had lost its way since its foundation. The operational success had produced strategic failure by transforming a security threat into a moral exemplar and generating sympathy for the whistleblower rather than understanding for Israel's security concerns. For Vanunu himself, the years since his release have been defined by continued restrictions and persistent advocacy for nuclear disarmament. He has remained in Israel against his will, unable to emigrate to the countries where he has supporters and allies. He has continued granting interviews to foreign media, despite the legal consequences, arguing that his freedom of speech cannot legitimately be suppressed by a democratic state. He has petitioned Israeli courts repeatedly to lift the restrictions, arguing that after decades any security rationale has expired and the restrictions serve only to punish him for past actions. Each petition has been denied, with courts accepting government arguments that he continues to pose a security risk. The case continues to raise fundamental questions about the balance between national security and individual rights, the legitimacy of whistleblowing when classified programs violate international norms, and the methods intelligence services can properly employ to protect state secrets. Vanunu believed that Israel's nuclear weapons program violated principles of nuclear non-proliferation, and that the world had a right to know the truth about Israel's arsenal. Israeli authorities believed that Vanunu had betrayed his legal obligations and disclosed classified information that harmed national security. Both positions contain elements of legitimacy that cannot be easily dismissed. The honey trap operation that brought Vanunu to the Rome apartment represents intelligence tradecraft at its most psychologically sophisticated and morally complex. Cheryl Bentov successfully exploited human vulnerability to achieve operational objectives using techniques that intelligence services have employed for centuries. The basic humanity of loneliness, the desire for connection, and the hope for romantic relationship were transformed into weapons deployed against a target. The operation worked because it exploited real emotional needs and created a relationship that felt genuine, even though it was entirely manufactured manipulation. From one perspective, this represents professional excellence in intelligence work. Cheryl Bentov identified her target's vulnerabilities, crafted an approach designed to exploit those specific weaknesses, executed her mission with discipline and skill, and achieved the operational objective. From another perspective, the operation represents a profound violation of human dignity that used emotional manipulation and betrayal of trust as tools of state power. The fact that the operation succeeded doesn't resolve the moral question of whether such methods should be employed against individuals whose crimes consisted of exposing information they believed the public needed to know. The legacy of the Vanunu affair extends beyond the individual case to influence how we think about whistleblowing, nuclear proliferation, intelligence operations, and the limits of state power. Vanunu's revelations confirmed what many suspected about Israel's nuclear program and shifted international discourse about Middle East proliferation. His treatment demonstrated the lengths to which states will go to punish those who disclose classified information, even when those disclosures serve public interest objectives. The honey trap operation showed the sophisticated psychological techniques intelligence services employ and the human costs of living in a world where emotional connections can be weaponized. And the exposure of Cheryl Bentov revealed that even successful operations can produce strategic failures when operational security proves inadequate. Decades after that September evening in Rome, Vanunu remains unable to leave Israel. Cheryl Bentov lives quietly in Florida, trying to escape her past, and Israel continues to maintain its policy of nuclear ambiguity, despite the revelations that everyone knows made that ambiguity a transparent fiction. The operation achieved its tactical objectives but created a martyr whose story continues to challenge Israel's actions and inspire those who believe in transparency over secrecy. The honey trap worked perfectly, but the strategic consequences of that success suggest that some operational victories produce losses that only become apparent years after the mission ends.